The call came late on a September evening in 1984. Johnny Cash was at home in Tennessee when the phone rang. It was Ernest Tubb's daughter. "Mr. Cash," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Daddy asked me to call you. He wants to see you. He says he needs to talk to you before it's too late." Cash felt something tighten in his chest. He'd heard Ernest was sick. Cancer, the word everyone whispered but nobody wanted to say out loud. But he hadn't realized it had gotten this bad. "When?" Cash asked. "Tonight, if you can. The doctors say he doesn't have much time. I'll be there in an hour." Cash drove to the hospital in Nashville alone. June had offered to come, but Cash had said no. This felt like something he needed to do by himself. He didn't know what Ernest wanted to say, but whatever it was, it felt private, personal. The hospital was quiet when Cash arrived. Visiting hours were over, but Ernest's family had made arrangements. A nurse led Cash down a dim hallway to a private room at the end. "He's been waiting for you," she said softly, then left Cash standing at the door. Cash took a breath and walked in. Ernest Tubb was lying in the hospital bed, propped up slightly on pillows. He looked smaller than Cash remembered, thinner. His skin had a grayish tint and his breathing was shallow, but his eyes were clear, alert. When he saw Cash, something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "John," Ernest said. His voice was weak but steady. "You came." "Of course I came," Cash said, walking to the bedside. He pulled up a chair and sat down. "Your daughter said you wanted to talk." Ernest nodded slowly. "I did. I do. There's something I need to say to you before I run out of time to say it." Cash waited. The room was quiet, except for the steady beep of a heart monitor and the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through tubes into Ernest's nose. "John," Ernest said, we haven't always seen eye to eye. No, we haven't. That night at the Opry, when you told me that you were destroying what we built, you remember that? I remember. We were both stubborn men, both convinced we were right, both too proud to back down." "We were," Cash agreed quietly. Ernest was quiet for a moment, gathering his strength. Then he said, "John, I need to tell you something. You won." Cash looked up sharply. "What?" "You won," Ernest repeated. "Country music changed. It became what you wanted it to be. Bigger, broader, more inclusive. You were right about that. The music needed to grow. It needed to reach people we weren't reaching, and it did, because of you." "But," Ernest continued, and there was something in his tone that made Cash lean forward, "that doesn't mean I was wrong to fight." Cash frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "I fought because I believed in something," Ernest said. "I believed country music meant something specific, that it represented certain values, certain traditions. And I wasn't wrong to believe that. Those things mattered. They still matter. Just because the music grew doesn't mean what came before was worthless." "I never thought it was worthless," Cash said quietly. "I know," Ernest said. "I know that now. But back then, I thought you were trying to erase us, to make what we'd built obsolete, and that scared me. So I fought you, not because I hated what you were doing, but because I loved what we'd done." Cash nodded slowly. "I understand." Ernest reached out a thin hand, and Cash took it. The grip was weak, but sincere. "We were both right, John, and we were both wrong. That's what I've come to understand. You were right that country music needed to change, and I was right that it was worth fighting to preserve something of what it had been. We just couldn't see that at the time. We only saw the fight." "We did," Cash agreed, his throat tight. Ernest closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly. When he opened them again, they were focused on Cash with an intensity that seemed at odds with his failing body. "John, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to really hear it. I'm listening. You won the fight, Ernest said. Country music is what you made it. But here's what I'm worried about. Now that you won, now that you changed everything, I'm afraid they're going to try to change you. Cash's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean the industry, the machine, the people who care more about money than music. They're going to look at what you did, at how you opened up country music to new audiences, and they're going to want to package that, sell it, turn it into something they can control. Ernest paused, catching his breath. The effort of talking was clearly exhausting him. And they're going to tell you to soften the edges, Ernest continued, to make it more commercial, more palatable. They're going to want you to be Johnny Cash the brand instead of Johnny Cash the man. And John, I need you to promise me something. What? Cash asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't let them change you. The words hung in the air between them, simple, direct, but carrying a weight that Cash felt settle onto his shoulders. The thing about you, John, Ernest said, his voice getting weaker now, is that you're real. What you do, who you are, it's not an act. It's not a performance. When you sing about prisoners, it's because you actually care about prisoners. When you wear black, it's because you actually identify with outcasts. That authenticity, that's your power. That's what made people listen to you even when they disagreed with you. Ernest squeezed Cash's hand with what little strength he had left. But success has a way of sanding down that authenticity, Ernest said, has a way of turning real people into products, and I've watched it happen to too many artists. They start out genuine, and by the end, they're just playing a character based on who they used to be. I won't let that happen, Cash said. Promise me, Ernest insisted. Promise me that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when the industry is trying to make you safe and palatable and profitable, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that what made you matter wasn't your commercial appeal. It was your refusal to be anything other than yourself. I promise, Cash said, and his voice cracked on the words. Ernest looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, You're the real thing, John. Don't ever forget that. Cash couldn't speak. He just sat there, holding Ernest Tubb's hand, tears running down his face. Thank you, Cash finally managed to say. His voice was breaking. Thank you, Ernest. Ernest smiled slightly. For what? For this. For calling me here. For saying what you said. We spent too many years at odds. I didn't want to leave without making peace, without telling you that I see you, John. I see what you've done, and I respect it, even if it wasn't what I would have done. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Cash couldn't trust himself to speak. Ernest seemed to be conserving his energy, his breathing shallow and labored. Finally, Ernest spoke again. You should go home, John. Go home to June. Tell her you love her. Don't wait as long as I did to say the things that matter. Cash nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I will. He stood up slowly, still holding Ernest's hand. Then he leaned down and did something he'd never done before. He kissed Ernest Tubb on the forehead. Goodbye, Ernest, Cash said. Not goodbye, Ernest replied, his voice barely audible now. Just see you later. Cash walked out of that hospital room knowing he'd never see Ernest Tubb alive again. And he was right. Ernest died later that night, just a few hours after Cash left, peacefully, the family said, as if he'd been holding on just long enough to say what he needed to say. The funeral was 3 days later. It was packed. Country music royalty filled the church, all coming to pay their respects to one of the genre's founding fathers. Cash sat in the third row with June. He didn't speak at the service. He couldn't. He knew if he tried, he'd break down. But after the service, as people were filing out, Ernest's daughter came up to Cash. She handed him a piece of paper. "Daddy wanted you to have this," she said. "He wrote it the day before you came to see him." Cash unfolded the paper. It was a note in Ernest's shaky handwriting. "John, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But I want you to remember what I told you. Stay real. Stay true. Don't let them make you into something you're not. Country music needs men like you, men who won't compromise their truth for commercial success. Thank you for fighting for what you believed in, and thank you for being brave enough to change the world. Ernest." Cash folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. He kept it there for weeks. Then he framed it and hung it in his office where he could see it every day. Years passed. Country music continued to evolve. Johnny Cash continued to make music, and he kept his promise to Ernest. When record labels wanted him to sound more modern, more radio-friendly, Cash said no. When producers wanted him to soften his image, to be less dark, less challenging, Cash refused. When the industry tried to push him toward commercial success at the expense of artistic integrity, Cash walked away. And when people asked him why he was so stubborn, why he wouldn't just give the industry what it wanted, Cash would think about that night in the hospital, about Ernest Tubb's last words to him, about the promise he'd made. In the 1990s, long after Ernest had died, Johnny Cash was doing an interview for a documentary about his career. The interviewer asked him what had kept him grounded through decades of success and fame. Cash was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Ernest Tubb taught me the most important lesson of my career." "What was that?" the interviewer asked. "He taught me that winning isn't enough. You can change the world. You can achieve everything you set out to do, but if you lose yourself in the process, you haven't really won anything. You've just traded one version of yourself for another." "When did he teach you this?" Cash's eyes got distant. "The night before he died. He called me to his hospital bed and he told me, 'Don't let them change you.' And I've tried to live by that ever since." "Who is them?" "Anyone who wants you to be less than you are for their convenience," Cash said. "The industry, the critics, the audience even. Anyone who wants you to file down your rough edges, to be easier to categorize, easier to market, easier to control." Ernest spent his life being true to what he believed country music should be. And even though we disagreed about what that was, he respected that I was doing the same thing. And his last gift to me was reminding me not to stop. The interviewer pressed, "Do you think about him often?" "Every time I'm faced with a choice between doing what's authentic and doing what's commercial," Cash said, "I hear his voice. 'You're the real thing, John. Don't ever forget that.' And I don't. I won't." Ernest Tubb's last words to Johnny Cash became a kind of guiding principle for the rest of Cash's career. Through the lean years in the 1980s when country radio wouldn't play his music, through his comeback with the American recordings in the 1990s, through every decision about what songs to record, what projects to take on, what image to project, Cash stayed true, stayed real, stayed himself. Not because it was easy, not because it was always commercially successful, but because he'd promised Ernest Tubb that he would, and because he'd learned that authenticity was more valuable than any amount of commercial success. The night Ernest Tubb died, Cash gave Johnny Cash a gift. Not just the gift of reconciliation, though that mattered. Not just the gift of respect, though that was meaningful.
but the gift of a warning wrapped in a blessing. You won. Don't let winning change you. It was a paradox, a challenge, a responsibility, and Johnny Cash carried it with him for the rest of his life. He thought about it when he refused to compromise his sound, when he recorded songs that were too dark, too challenging, too real for mainstream country radio. When he worked with Rick Rubin on the American recordings, stripping his music down to its raw essence instead of polishing it for commercial appeal. Every time someone asked him to be less authentic for the sake of broader appeal, Cash remembered Ernest Tubb's hospital room, the weak voice, the fierce eyes, the simple command, "Don't let them change you." And every time, Cash said no. Because Ernest Tubb had taught him something crucial in those final moments, that the fight for authenticity never ends, that success doesn't mean you can relax and let the industry shape you, that staying true to yourself is a constant, active choice. It's easy to be authentic when you're struggling, when you have nothing to lose. The real test comes when you've achieved everything you wanted, when you have fame and success and influence, when changing, compromising, softening your edges would be so easy and so profitable. That's when authenticity requires real courage.
And that's what Ernest Tubb understood. He'd seen too many artists lose themselves in success, seen too many genuine voices get smoothed into commercial products, and he didn't want that to happen to Johnny Cash. Not because he agreed with everything Cash did, not because he thought Cash's vision for country music was perfect, but because he recognized that Cash's authenticity was valuable, that country music, that all music, needed people who refused to become commodities. So with his last words, Ernest Tubb gave Johnny Cash permission to keep being difficult, keep being uncompromising, keep being real. And Cash honored that gift for the rest of his life. When Johnny Cash died in 2003, among his personal effects was a framed note, the one Ernest Tubb had written the day before that final conversation. The one that said, "Stay real, stay true. Don't let them make you into something you're not." Cash had looked at that note almost every day for nearly 20 years. It had guided him through difficult decisions, through career challenges, through moments when compromise would have been easier than authenticity. And in the end, Johnny Cash was remembered not just for his music, but for his unwavering authenticity, for being exactly who he was, without apology, without compromise, without ever letting the industry sand down his rough edges. That was Ernest Tubb's final gift to him, and Johnny Cash never forgot it. The last words Ernest Tubb spoke to Johnny Cash were, "You're the real thing, John. Don't ever forget that." And Cash never did.